I'm Linda Stricker. First, my qualifications. I've read several dozen books about the Amish and Mennonites, attended Old Order Amish, Conservative Mennonite, and Beachy Amish, you'll find out what that is later, churches in Ohio for nearly a decade. I also belonged to one of those churches for about a decade. And more recently, I belonged to a Mennonite Church USA congregation outside of Williamsville, which no longer exists. So this is the first part in a three-part series on Amish society and culture. Yes?
Can you hear it on the loop or no? You can have the loop. What? Do you have to hook up for the loop? No, I don't hear it away. Well, the lights in there.
Yeah. Is that something you do, or I have a? I can't hear you.
Yes, I'll do it.
Okay. How about now? Okay. All right, so the first part today isn't going to be the pretty pictures about quilts and Amish buggies and so on. It's going to be the background, the history of the Amish, to give you the basis for the other two parts. Well, we'll be dealing with things like how the Amish live day to day, what their schooling is like, how their clothes work compared to everybody else's, that sort of thing. Right. Now, I created a full semester course, Amish Society and Culture, at Indiana University. The course was built on 3 books: John Hostetler's Amish Society, Donald Crabill's Riddle of Amish Culture, and Stephen Nolt's History of the Amish. We took a field trip to southern Indiana to attend an Amish Sunday school. We took a field trip to northern Indiana to stay overnight, eat at an Amish home, and visit Amish businesses. Sorry for the delay, my computer went black on me. It did not realize I was still using it. I'm glancing down as I talk. And we also visited a couple of Amish stores. Professor Nolt joined us for one class and answered questions from the students afterward and ate lunch with us. So then students chose final projects that ranged from PowerPoint presentations to making Amish recipes to videos and oral reports. I hope you'll enjoy this Reader's Digest version of the course, where I've condensed 45 class hours at the university down to 3 for you. And of course, that kind of cut out the field trips and the Amish stores. All right, let's begin. On Monday, October 2nd, 2006, in Bart Township, Pennsylvania, at 10:25 a.m., a milk tanker truck driver for the Amish named Charles Carl Roberts IV backed a pickup truck to the front of the one-room Amish schoolhouse just after the children had come in from recess. He entered the school and asked awkwardly if anyone had seen a missing Clovis pin out on the road. No one had. He left the classroom, went back to his truck, and returned with a Springfield Armory XD 9mm handgun. He told the boys to help him bring some things into the school from the truck. While they were gone, teacher Emma Mae Zook and her mother, who'd been visiting the school, ran to a nearby farm for help, and there asked Amos Smoker to call 911. The call was recorded at 10:36 a.m. Meanwhile, the boys carried in lumber, a shotgun, stun gun, wires, chains, nails, hooks, and a small bag containing plastic ties and some tools. At about the same time that the 911 call had gone through, Roberts let a pregnant woman, 3 visiting parents with babies, and all 15 boys go. Somehow at the same time, 9-year-old Emma Fisher escaped with them, unnoticed. Roberts then used the lumber to barricade the door to the school. The back wall of the school had no windows. An Amishman with 2 large dogs took advantage of that to sneak up on the building and slowly around appear in a side window. At 10:42, he saw a Pennsylvania State Patrol car approaching but not slowing down. The Amishman sprinted from his hiding place to the road, waving his arms, and the state trooper made a quick U-turn and parked. Police had communicated with Roberts using the PA speakers then on their vehicles, and state and county dispatchers contacted him by phone. A crowd of police, EMTs, and neighbors gathered. At 10:55, he arranged the tied-up girls in a line along the blackboard. Just before 11, his wife came home and found 4 suicide notes, one addressed to her and one for each of their 3 children. Roberts called her by cell phone and also called the police and told them to leave. 2 sisters, Marion and Barbara Fisher, ages 13 and 11, began negotiating with him to shoot them first, trying to buy time for rescue. At 11:07, Roberts fired over a dozen rounds, presumably from his handgun, and state police immediately rushed the building as the shots began, reaching the windows just as they stopped. The county coroner later disputed the number of shots fired, saying that one girl alone had over a dozen Browning 12-gauge rounds from his shotgun in her, and that she had been forced to turn over the autopsy to a colleague to finish. Two girls had died in the schoolhouse, one in a state trooper's arms. Another was pronounced dead at Lancaster General Hospital. 2 sisters survived until the next morning when their parents took them off life support. So Marion Stoltzfus Fisher, 13, died at the scene. Naomi Rose Ebersol, 7, died at the scene. Anna Mae Stoltzfus, 12, was declared dead on arrival. Lena Zook Miller, 7, died at Milton S. Hershey Medical Center the next day, October 3rd. Mary Liz Miller, 9, died at Christiana Hospital in Newark, Delaware the next day, October 3rd. Rosanna King, 6, was removed from life support at Milton S. Hershey Medical Center and sent home at the request of her family on October 4th. She remained at home for the rest of her life. Her family said she smiled often and seemed to recognize them, although she was unable to walk, talk, or feed herself. And she passed away on September 3rd, 2024, at the age of 23. As for the injured, all of the surviving girls were hospitalized. Rachel Ann Stoltzfus, 8, returned to school months later. Barbara Fisher, 11, needed surgery. I believe that was in her shoulder, but she was soon pitching school softball. Sarah Ann Stoltzfus, 12, not expected to survive, returned to school, partly blind in one eye. Esther King, 13, returned to school, graduated from 8th grade, and went to work on the family farm. By 2007, about $4.3 million had been donated to the Nickel Mines School Fund for the expenses of the families of the victims. The school was demolished the week after the shootings and returned to pasture. A new one-room schoolhouse named New Hope School was built on a different lot nearby, designed to look as different from the previous school as possible, and opened exactly 6 months after the massacre. The demolition on the original school began 1 week to the day from the shootings, before daylight. Here it is when it's almost finished. Amish neighbors and community members comforted the Roberts family just hours after the shooting, visiting his wife, parents, and parents-in-law. One Amish man held Robert's father in his arms for an hour as he sobbed uncontrollably. Marie Roberts, the killer's widow, was invited to the funeral of one of the victims, and about 30 Amish attended Roberts' funeral. Mrs. Roberts wrote an open letter to the Amish saying, "Your love for our family has helped to provide the healing we so desperately need. Gifts you've given have touched our hearts in a way no words can describe. Your compassion has reached beyond our family, beyond our community, and is changing our world. And for this, we sincerely thank you." The Amish established a charitable fund for her and her children. Recommended reading about the massacre if you are interested, and you can check with me on this again after the presentation if you don't have a chance to write this down from the screen. But these 4 books all are dedicated solely to the tragedy and its aftermath. Forgiveness, forgoing revenge, letting go of grudges, and nonviolence are fundamental tenets of the Amish religion. Over the next 2 sessions, you'll learn what they believe and why, what makes them different and why, what is admirable about them, and their faults and problems too. We'll examine how they dress, travel, live, and worship. But as I mentioned earlier today, you'll first learn where they came from. It all starts with the Renaissance, a great humanistic rebirth of arts and sciences in Europe, marking the move from the Dark Ages into modern times. The Renaissance was motivated by the rallying cry, ad fontes, to the source. Sculptors and painters sought to emulate Greek and Roman art and to build upon it. Authors to emulate the classics of Virgil and Plato. And biblical scholars set aside the Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible to study the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek manuscripts directly on a large scale that hadn't been seen for centuries. This drove a fervor for Bible study and to translating the Bible into the languages of the common people so that they could study it too. Made possible once the Dutch humanist Erasmus developed a critical text of the New Testament and published it with the new printing press. Enter a Catholic monk named Martin Luther in the region called Germany about 350 years before it became a nation. He studied the Bible assiduously and found what he read there at odds with many Catholic teachings. On Halloween 1517, he posted challenges to the church on the local bulletin board, the door of the city church. Today we think of this as a great heroic thing. Well, it was heroic because of what it was he was posting, but nailing things up on the church door was the normal way people communicated. If you were in 1517 and you lost your cat, you'd nail a notice about your missing cat on the church door. Anyway, this is the day we mark as the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. By 1519, a reformer had appeared in Switzerland. Mostly the green area at the bottom of the screen here, named Ulrich Zwingli, the newly appointed pastor of the great church in Zurich. Zurich, now you're seeing a close-up of Switzerland, where this all started. Zurich is the major city in the north here. He was a graduate of a scholarly center of Renaissance humanism, heavily influenced by Erasmus, the University of Basel, and barely survived a case of bubonic plague his first year in the city. This is one portrait of Zwingli. He quickly gathered a band of young men dedicated to Bible study. He and his students began to veer off from Luther's teachings. Finding some of the Catholic beliefs and practices Luther continued, worthy of being discontinued, and some of the reforms he instituted not going far enough, based on their careful parsing of the scriptures. Zwingli had adopted Erasmian pacifism, as did his students. He soon persuaded the city council to abolish the Mass. And he wrote his own liturgy in German for the Lord's Supper, proposing that it be held quarterly to emphasize the importance of the sermon as the central part of weekly worship services. You went to church to learn. You went to church to be given lectures. Well, okay. He abandoned the lectionary, instead engaging in expository preaching of the book of Matthew, going on to use biblical exegesis to interpret Acts, the epistles, then the Hebrew Bible. He managed to get the council to ban veneration of images, ended clerical processions with relics and images. He secretly married, going public shortly before the birth of his first child, and persuaded the council to confiscate the monasteries to use for a hospital and other charitable purposes for the poor, while retiring the monks and nuns by granting them pensions. So he closed those down, but he didn't just send them out in the street with no way to support themselves. He refused someone sent by the Pope to sell indulgences from even entering the city gates. Other than effectively founding the Swiss Reformed Church, Zwingli's most lasting achievement was advocating for and contributing to the Froschauer Bible, the first complete Bible ever published in the German language, in 1531. To this day, it is still the Bible used by the Hutterites, a communal Anabaptist group living in 3 prairie states and 3 prairie provinces of Canada. Note that since 395 CE, under Emperor Theodosius, church and state were united throughout Europe, a fact that was rarely challenged or opposed. It was not merely taken for granted, but seen as fundamental to the social order. If church and state were ever separated, it would lead to anarchy in the streets and violent, utter lawlessness. The sky would fall. Sin would reign and wickedness would be unrestrained. And thus, for nearly every single reform he sought to institute, Master Zwingli petitioned the City Council of Zurich to pass. If he violated a church canon without advance permission from the government, when ecclesial authorities came after him for it, he engaged the council for its protection and blessing of his actions. Church and state were as united in Zurich as they had ever been anywhere. Some of the most brilliant of Zwingli's Bible students grew impatient with their teacher waiting on city councilors for every major move. They believed reform was taking too long and not going far enough. They also accused Zwingli of reneging on his earlier teaching that baptism was reserved for those who had repented of their sins and wished to confess their faith in Christ. By 1525, these students, led by Felix Manz and Konrad Grebel, began baptizing adult believers in the home of Manz's mother. Soon joined by George Blaurock, they called themselves the Swiss Brethren. Blaurock, so called because of his blue coat, his real name was Jörg vom Haus Jakob, had been educated at the University of Leipzig before becoming a priest, and arrived in Zurich with his wife in 1524. In January 1525, in direct opposition to a city council mandate that banned the practice, Blaurock asked Konrad Grebel to baptize him upon confession of faith. Grebel, a civil engineer, complied. Then Blaurock baptized all the rest of those gathered. While Grebel died of the plague in 1526, Zwingli's gifted student Felix Manz was the first to suffer the edict of the Zurich Council, declaring the punishment for rebaptism. On 5th January 1527, he was drowned in the Lamont River by the Swiss Protestants for the capital crime of believers' baptism. Blaurock, who had been banished from Switzerland, conducted a very successful ministry in the Austrian Tyrol, in what is now Italy. Oh, that's right, I don't have the map up again. All right. So this is the Tyrol, today part of Italy, which was at that time part of Austria and an area that later became part of Switzerland. So he went all the way down there, came up here, and also into South Germany. Considering this is before planes and cars and trains, that was quite some travel. All right, in August 1529, the Innsbruck authorities arrested and tortured him for information. On 6th September, the Austrian Catholics burned him at the stake for heresy. Meanwhile, Michael Sattler, a former Benedictine monk from Germany who had married Margareta, a former Beguine. Is that Beguine? I actually looked that up before the presentation and then forgot. Well, she was a lay nun. And she had joined the Swiss Brethren and been expelled from Zurich. Pictured on the screen now, that's the great church of Zurich. After which he engaged in missionary activity across southern Germany, including the city of Strasbourg, a German city now in France. In February 1527, to reunite the movement, as a few minor schisms had begun to develop, Sattler convened a meeting in Schleitheim, a Swiss city on the border with Germany, in the canton of Schaffhausen, up here at the very tippy top of Switzerland. Schleitheim is right on the border, right about above the letter U on the map. They chose to adopt a common confession that all could agree upon. Nearly all the Swiss Brethren adopted the Schleitheim Confession of Faith, which reaffirmed believers' baptism, excommunication of the unrepentant, the cup and bread of the Lord reserved for baptized believers, support and qualification for pastors, separation from evil, non-violence, including prohibition of serving in the government or military, and prohibition against oaths, as taught by Jesus and James. Zwingli, incidentally, having given up Erasmian pacifism as a puppet and puppeteer of the city council, had chosen to live by the sword, and he died by the sword on the battlefield in 1531. Give me a moment here. Okay, here we go. All right, I know we're back to where the screen shows the other slides along the side, but you still get most of the image. To summarize again, Conrad Grebel died of plague in 1526, but Felix Manz was martyred in 1527, Michael Sattler was martyred in 1527, and Georg Blaurock was martyred in 1529. So in May 1527, getting to Sattler now, his wife and several other Anabaptists were captured by Austrian Catholic authorities and imprisoned in what is now Baden-Württemberg in Germany. That's directly above Switzerland. The ruler of Austria, Archduke Ferdinand, demanded that he be immediately drowned as an Anabaptist. But Joachim I, elector of Brandenburg, an elector as part of the conclave who selects a new Holy Roman Emperor, wanted due process and insisted on a full public trial. Sattler was charged with defying the emperor, rejecting the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, rejecting infant baptism, extreme unction, dishonoring the saints, teaching against oaths, practicing the love feast, marrying, and advocating non-resistance. Sattler denied that he defied the imperial edicts or dishonored the saints, but he defended the remaining charges as moral and biblical. He also denied that courts should have any jurisdiction in religious doctrine. Upon conviction, his sentence read, "Michael Sattler shall be committed to the executioner. The latter shall take him to the square and there first cut out his tongue, and then forge him fast to a wagon, and there with glowing iron tongs twice tear pieces from his body, then on the way to the site of execution 5 times more as above, and then burn his body to powder as an arch heretic." The other men in the group were executed by sword, and the women, including Margareta, were executed by drowning. Sattler's tongue had been removed because previous Anabaptists had gained converts with their testimonies in preaching to the crowd at their executions. The Bernese government formed a police force named Teufeljäger, the Anabaptist hunters, and that was their sole job. The teachings of the Swiss Brethren spread across Switzerland, and then Austria, eastern France, and southern Germany. This is the cover of the Schleitheim Confession before that reunited the Swiss Brethren early on. It says, "Brüderlich Vereinigung etlicher Kinder Gottes, 7 Artikel betreffend," a brotherly union of a number of children of God concerning 7 articles. From southern Germany, they spread further to the Netherlands and northern Germany. Anabaptists were executed by various means, persecuted and imprisoned by Catholic, Lutheran, and Reformed authorities almost everywhere that they were found. When the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended the 30 Years' War among Catholics and Protestants, signed by the Holy Roman Emperor, and representative of the kings of France and Sweden and all their respective allies, stipulated that the religion of the people of any state shall be the religion of the ruler of that state. Anabaptists, therefore, were not covered by the treaty. Now, let me make that a little clearer. That doesn't mean that the ruler will be Catholic if the people are Catholic. It means the people will be Catholic if the ruler is Catholic. If the ruler is a Lutheran, then the church of that country will be Lutheran, and so will all the people of that state, and so forth. Okay, another view of the spread of Anabaptists. From Switzerland into southern Germany and to what we now call eastern France, up into Poland, northern Germany, the Netherlands, and an area of the Netherlands called Friesland, right along the coast. Menno Simons of Witmarsum in Friesland was ordained a priest around 1515 in Utrecht. After studying Greek, Latin church fathers, but was as common at the time, he never read the Bible before or during his studies for the priesthood, fearing that it would influence him for the worse. He later called his avoidance of the Bible at that time in his life stupid. In 1524, he was appointed to the church in his father's hometown in southwest Friesland. On the smaller map up here, that would be right above the center of the Netherlands. Having recently finally begun reading the Bible, he soon also studied the works of Martin Luther, Martin Butzer of Strasbourg, as well as Zwingli's successor in Zurich, and Erasmus of Rotterdam. In Friesland, he came into contact directly with Anabaptist preachers. In 1535, his brother Peter died during the retaking of a monastery seized by Anabaptists associated with the violent Münsterite rebellion. So there was a sect of Münsterites that believed in union of church and state, and that the state should be their church, and they took over the government by force. That, of course, is completely repudiated by all of the other Anabaptists. His brother's conversion and death sent Menno into a spiral, into a deep crisis. By 1536, he had joined the mainstream Anabaptists, who rejected all violence, and was baptized by Obi Philips. He and his brother Dirk Philips were leaders of the peaceful Anabaptists among the Dutch, and were at the time nicknamed the Obanites. But by 1544, Menno's influence by personal example and as a prolific author had extended so far that all Dutch Anabaptists were generally known as Menists or Mennonites. Menno Simons died peacefully at home in 1561 in a northern German village where the ruler allowed persecuted Mennonites to settle. The village was wiped out by the 30 Years' War, and the Mennonite Church of Hamburg placed a memorial there in 1906. In order to heal more schisms that had gradually formed among the Dutch Anabaptists in the decades after Menno's death, another confession was adopted at a meeting in Dort, 1632. The Dordrecht Confession of Faith covered the fundamentals of Christian belief as well as the Anabaptist distinctives of nonviolence, non-swearing of oaths, a stricter position on excommunication and shunning, and the Dutch practice of foot washing according to the example of Jesus, and mentioned as an early church practice in a book attributed to Paul. In 1725, a Mennonite bishop and 16 other ministers from southeastern Pennsylvania met to adopt that confession, with the result that foot washing became an ordinance of the Mennonite churches in America, even though outside of the Netherlands it was not common in Europe, even to this day. Meanwhile, a Swiss Brethren bishop named Jacob Amann had come across the Dordrecht Confession and regarded it as biblically sound. He advocated for a much stricter application of excommunication and shunning, for simple conservative clothing, adoption of foot washing as a church ordinance, stricter separation from the world, and for men not to trim their beards. He went on a speaking tour throughout the Swiss cantons, Alsace, the German-speaking area today under the control of France, and all the way to the Palatinate of the German Rhineland, pushing his views and excommunicating anyone who rejected them. In 1693, those Swiss and Alsatian bishops and ministers who joined Amann in signing the Dordrecht Confession of Faith and accepting his harsher views on discipline separated themselves from the other Swiss brethren and came to be known as the Amish, or Amish. With the promise of cheap farmland and religious liberty, especially freedom from military conscription, High German-speaking Amish from the Palatinate came to accept William Penn's promise of no persecution beginning in the early 1700s. So did some Swiss and South German Mennonites who formed the Mennonite Church in America and later Canada. Around the 1840s to 50s, fleeing post-war Europe and famine, Swiss and Alsatian Amish speaking their own Swiss dialects of German settled in Indiana. Likewise, Low German speaking Mennonites from the Netherlands and northern Germany, including what is now Poland, and Russia and Ukraine came in the late 1800s. Take a step back. The Mennonites who settled in Canada and the prairie of the United States who spoke Low German had settled in the Russian Empire at the invitation of Catherine the Great on the promise of no military conscription. And they settled mostly in Ukraine, but also in part of Russia proper. And somewhat over 100, 150 years later, the government went back on its promise not to draft anybody into the military. And so they picked up and moved to North America, still speaking the Low German dialects that they had arrived from in the 1700s when they moved to Russia from Germany and the lowlands. So that's the weird mystery to why Russian Mennonites speak Low German. Low German is almost indistinguishable from Dutch. A few years ago, the Mennonite Church and the General Conference Mennonite Church, which formed from those Russian Mennonites, simultaneously merged as one church in the US and split so that they were also one church in Canada. So they had been the Mennonite Church, which was US and Canada, and the General Conference Mennonite Church in the US and Canada. And now they became the Mennonite Church Canada and the Mennonite Church USA. Now back to the Amish. The Pennsylvania Dutch-speaking Amish settled in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and spread widely from there. And the Swiss German-speaking Amish settled in Indiana a century later, where they mostly remain today and still speak their separate dialect. Until the 20th century, the main distinction between the Amish and other Mennonites in North America had been Jacob Amann's emphasis on stricter church discipline, with the imposition of excommunication and very strict shunning as a last resort. His insistence on men wearing untrimmed beards and a stronger separation from the world. At first, more and more noticeable as the Amish kept the same Central European peasant dress, the same styles they had emigrated with, and their avoidance of urban life and occupations. Still, with everyone using horses for transportation and nobody having electricity, and only the rich living in or near big cities and having telephones, about the only way to tell the Amish apart from Mennonites was that the former wore only solid colors, no pattern printed fabrics, and the latter usually shaved their beards. Both Amish and Mennonites lived as other strict Christians did for the most part in other ways, although most Amish were distinctive for meeting in homes or barns instead of meeting houses, like this one, and continuing to speak German as others began to acclimate or assimilate. Pennsylvania Dutch was the common language of the Amish, the Mennonites, the Brethren, and also the German immigrants who were Catholics, Lutherans, and Reformed. The Amish kept the language as the English as they came to be known. The Lutherans, the Reformed, and Catholics gave it up and assimilated, and the Mennonites gradually did the same. A couple last quick notes here. Menno Simons was from Friesland. This whole area at the time of the Reformation was Friesland. It's now limited mostly to these islands and a couple of little pieces of land. But this shows how large it was at one time. It was a separate country, basically, and the people there spoke Frisian, which is the language on earth closest to English. And that is Alsace, the German-speaking area of what is now France. You can see Strasbourg near the top. That was a large Anabaptist center. Any questions about the history? We've basically gone to around the Civil War, and the remaining history will be rolled into the specific things talked about in the next two sessions, such as education, clothing, horse and buggy, and so on. But any questions about today's history? No questions at all? Okay. Well, we're done for today. I just want to remind you the funner part starts next time when we start dealing with Amish clothing, Amish foods, horse and buggy, and that sort of thing. And for that, there'll be a lot more pretty pictures for you to look at. Thank you.